Students, welcome to this lecture on minorities in the Indian context, historical background. The idea of minority identity in India has deep historical roots that predate independence. India has always been a land of multiple religions, language and communities. Yet, under British rule or colonial rule, this diversity was reorganized through political and administrative categories. The British introduced the idea of representing religious and linguistic groups as distinct political entities. Before that, in pre-colonial India, different communities coexisted without being formally classified as majority or minority. The colonial census, however, quantified population by religion, creating political consciousness based on numerical identity. This classification profoundly influenced modern Indian politics. By the time of independence, religious and cultural divisions had been institutionalized in law and governance. Understanding this evolution helps explain why the framers of the Indian Constitution were cautious in defining minority protections. They wanted to safeguard diversity without repeating colonial mistakes. So, this lecture explores the historical journey from pre-colonial pluralism to colonial communal politics and finally to the constitutional vision of unity in diversity, showing how India's minority framework was shaped by history, politics and the struggle for justice and inclusion. Before colonial intervention, Indian social structure was plural yet accommodative. Ancient texts and empires such as the Mauryan and Gupta dynasties governed multi-religious populations through tolerance and pragmatic administration. Buddhism and Jainism arose as reformist movements within the broader Hindu tradition, not as antagonistic minorities. The Mughal Empire, particularly under Akbar, introduced the principle of Sulh-ul-Kul, that is universal peace, where diverse faiths were respected. Regional kingdoms like Vijayanagar and Ahom also displayed religious inclusivity. Communities were often organized through guilds, castes and local traditions rather than religious opposition. Cultural exchange flourished through trade, art and language. Persian, Sanskrit and vernacular languages coexisted in administration and literature. Thus, the term minority in the modern sense did not exist. Identities were fluid and belonging was shaped more by region and profession than by faith or language. This period demonstrated that pluralism could coexist with stability when diversity was managed through mutual respect rather than political separation. Pre-colonial India's inclusive governance provided the philosophical foundation that the Constitution later sought to restore in modern secular form. The advent of British rule and categorization. British colonial rule marked a turning point in how diversity was understood and administered. The British introduced modern census system, codified laws and separate legal categories for communities. The first All India census of 1871 classified Indians by religion, language and caste. This act transformed flexible social identities into rigid administrative labels. Communities began to see themselves as distinct political groups, each seeking protection or a favor from colonial authorities. British policies such as divide and rule deliberately deepened these divisions to weaken national unity. The 1858 transfer of power from the East India Company to the Crown institutionalized a policy of religious neutrality, but in practice, communal separation grew. The legal system's recognition of different personal laws for Hindus and Muslims further entrenched communal identities. Education policies also encouraged communal representation. By framing governance through community identity, the British transformed diversity into potential conflict. These divisions would later influence constitutional debates on minority safeguards. Understanding this colonial legacy is crucial for grasping the origins of modern minority discourse in India. The impact of colonial census and classification. The colonial census, conducted regularly from 1871 onwards, was more than a demographic exercise. It was a political tool. For the first time, Indians were categorized according to religion, caste, tribe, and language in a standardized format. This process created new boundaries between communities that had previously coexisted with shared practices. The British approach reduced complex identities into mutually exclusive groups, fostering a sense of competition. Officials like H.S. Risley even described caste and race as determinants of social worth, linking governance to hierarchy. This classification made communities aware of their numerical strength, giving rise to demands for separate political representation. The notion of majority and minority entered Indian politics through this administrative mechanism. Muslims, Christians, and Sikhs began seeking recognition as distinct political constituencies. Over time, this quantitative understanding of society produced communal politics that would shape India's path to independence. The colonial census thus laid the structural foundation for both minority consciousness and future demands for constitutional protection in the modern Indian state. Communal representation and the Indian Councils Act. The Indian Councils Act of 1909, known as Morley Minto Reforms, institutionalized communal representation by granting separate electorates for Muslims. This was the first official recognition of religious communities as political entities. It allowed Muslims to elect their own representatives, independent of the general electorate. While intended to reassure minority participation, it inadvertently strengthened communal divisions. Later acts, including those of 1919 and 1935, expanded this system to Sikhs, Christians, and Anglo-Indians. The reforms converted religious identity into a political instrument, reinforcing the idea that communal interests required separate representation. Leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Annie Besant warned that this system endangered national unity. However, Muslim leaders viewed it as essential for protecting their political voice, and Britishers encouraged it as they wanted to create rifts between different communities to keep the national movement divided and weak, and that sectorial differences should hegemonize the national interest. The British thus encouraged separate identities to counter nationalist consolidation. By the 1930s, India's political discourse had become heavily communalized. These developments explain why the framers of independent India rejected separate electorates in favor of universal franchise, promoting unity through shared citizenship rather than community-based representation. The freedom struggle and minority debates. During the freedom movement, the question of minority protection became a central political issue. Leaders across parties debated how to balance a national unity with cultural autonomy. The Congress Party initially promoted composite nationalism, emphasizing unity beyond religion. The Muslim League, however, argued that Muslims constituted a separate nation requiring political safeguards. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Maulana Azad believed that the interfaith harmony was integral to India's identity, while leaders such as M.A. Jinnah insisted on distinct representation. The Lucknow Pact of 1916 temporarily reconciled these positions by accepting separate electorates for Muslims within a united India. Yet communal tensions deepened after the Khilafat movement and partition of Bengal. The emergence of the idea of Pakistan in 1940s was a direct result of the failure to integrate minority protection into a common constitutional vision. Thus, debates on minority rights during the freedom struggle were not merely legal, they defined the moral and political boundaries of India's nationhood. The role of Indian National Congress and Muslim League. The Indian National Congress, formed in 1885 with the British support, began as an inclusive platform but gradually struggled to represent all communities equally. By the early 20th century, Muslims and other minorities feared marginalization within a predominantly Hindu political structure. However, this was more a apprehension or a created or a manufactured fear by the Muslim political leadership of the time or the Muslim elite. While common Muslim was not much bothered about the idea of marginalization or a separate state of Pakistan. The Muslim League, founded in 1906, emerged as their political voice, emphasizing communal identity. Early leaders like Aga Khan and Nawab Salimullah demanded constitutional guarantees for minority participation. The Congress leadership, including Gandhi, Nehru and many other leaders, emphasized secularism and joint electorates, believing that religion should not define citizenship. However, British policies like separate electorates and differential recruitment reinforced division. The 1937 provincial elections showed widening gaps between the two parties' support bases. The League's two-nation theory gained strength, claiming that Hindus and Muslims formed distinct nations. This ideological divergences shaped the communal politics that led to partition. However, the idea of a Islamic state was not new or was not something given by Muslim League. It goes back to the period of Shah Waliullah, when much before the arrival of the Britishers, when he always dreamed of creating or converting India from Darul Harb to Darul Islam. But later on, it was further strengthened by Britishers, and that finally turned into the demand for a separate state of Pakistan on the basis of religion or Islamic nationalism. These ideological divergences, sharpened by Britishers by their just mentioned policies, shaped the communal politics that led to partition, and later on also it continued to dominate or characterize the Indian politics. The legacy of this divide influenced the constitution makers, who later designed protections to secure minority rights without repeating the mistakes of political separatism. The partition and its consequences for minorities. The partition of India in 1947 marked one of the most tragic and transformative events in modern history. One of the most violent migration, where millions were displaced and communal violence claimed countless lives. The creation of Pakistan as a separate state for Muslims left behind a large Muslim population in India, suddenly turning them into a significant minority within a new secular republic. Similarly, Hindus and Sikhs became minorities in Pakistan. Partition exposed the dangers of defining nationhood on religious lines. In India, leaders there were a number of leaders who realized that only a secular constitution could ensure justice and equality for all. The trauma of partition shaped India's approach to minority protection, emphasizing integration, not separation. Articles guaranteeing freedom of religion, language, and education were framed as safeguards against future alienation. Moreover, India was not in a position to take communalism as another challenge at that particular point of time, when India was struggling with the national integration of the princely states with India and securing the borders. Thus, the experience of partition turned minority rights into a cornerstone of India's unity, promoting coexistence through law rather than fear or privilege. The Constituent Assembly deliberated extensively on minority safeguards between 1946 and 1949. Members were deeply influenced by the partition experience but determined to create an inclusive democracy. The Advisory Committee on Minorities, chaired by Sardar Patel, examined demands for separate representation, cultural autonomy, and educational freedom. It recommended retaining cultural and educational rights but rejected political separation. Leaders like H.C. Mukherjee, Ambedkar, and Munshi argued that equality before law was sufficient, provided the constitution ensured freedom of religion and culture. As a result, the assembly included Articles 29 and 30 to protect linguistic and religious minorities. The framers believed that the best security for minorities was the fairness of the majority. Debates revealed a consensus: India would be a secular state with full rights for all citizens but no political segregation. This vision combined historical lessons with democratic idealism, creating a model of unity in diversity that continues to guide India's constitutional practice today. We'll continue in next lecture.